weeks, we've been in a series of studies in the book of Ecclesiastes. We started with an introduction into what the book is about, its main message, as well as who the author of the book is, and what the purpose behind the writing was, and we divided up the book in that introduction. We have, since that introduction, taken 2 chapters per study, and so we studied chapters 1 and 2. Chapter 1, the introductory chapter, all is vanity. Chapter 2, focusing on the vanity, as we called it, of those 5 W's that Solomon had tried: wine, women, wealth, wisdom of the earthly kind, and work. We then the next week studied 3 and 4. Chapter 3 focusing on God's providential control, and chapter 4 on the vanity of toil under the sun. A couple of weeks, or more than a couple of weeks ago, because I was out of town, about 3 weeks ago, we studied 5 and 6, chapter 5, enjoying life but only with God, and chapter 6, focusing on the vanity of riches. And then last week, we talked about the value and limits of wisdom in chapter 7, and then focused on wisdom in practice, or practically living it out in our life, in chapter 8. What we want to do here tonight is continue that study in Ecclesiastes by looking at chapter 9 and chapter 10 here this evening. We'll give titles and a breakdown of those more in just a moment. Before we move on, I do want to pause for a moment and encourage you, if you haven't already, to turn your Bibles to Ecclesiastes chapter 9. Put a marker there at 9 and 10. We'll be spending our time in those 2 chapters here this evening, looking at what Solomon has to say and making practical application in our life. Before we get into chapter 9, though, and we'll do as we've done, we'll look at 9, then we'll look at 10, then we'll come back and talk about some practical lessons. But before we get into chapter 9 and 10, I want to pause for just a moment to look at the 4 discourses. We've been reminding ourselves of these 4 discourses. This is how Brother Bob Waldron outlined the book, very similar to how Kaiser did in his material, whom Brother Waldron references several times. In his own material, he references Kaiser's. Both divided the book down into 4 discourses. We broke those down in lesson 1 in detail as to what those are. But as you look at the 4 discourses, we've covered the entirety of the first 3, and we've covered 2 verses of the final one, as the final one is the only discourse that begins not at a new chapter. And so the first 2 chapters focused, as the book as a whole mentions a lot, but the first 2 chapters in particular on vanity of the things under the sun and how they don't bring pleasure. Again, 3, 4, and 5 more focus on vanity, the toil, but God has providential control, so we need to make sure we use our time wisely. And then talking about some about riches in 5, and then chapter 6 dealt a lot with riches, and 7 and 8 with wisdom in discourse 3. Again, the last 2 verses we closed with last week is the beginning of discourse 4. Brother Waldron pointed out in his material, there's not really any new material introduced in this final discourse. We've paralleled it. I think we paralleled it before. If you are familiar with the legal system, or maybe watching a show, when arguing before a judge, the lawyers are not allowed to bring new material into closing arguments, and that's just for tying together what everything else has been said. That's really what Solomon is doing in these final 4 chapters and a couple of verses of 8. He doesn't really introduce any new concept that's not been mentioned, at least in part in the book, but tying all of that together here as we get in the closing or the home stretch of Ecclesiastes. As we get ready for chapter 9 now this evening, I would title Ecclesiastes chapter 9, Death is Certain and Life is Not. That is, what Solomon focuses on, and we'll divide it down into 2 sections in a minute, is the fact that death is a certainty of life, regardless of where one stands. Whether good or bad, rich or poor, whatever it is, that death is something that is certain in life. He then, at verse 11 through the end of the chapter, talks about the uncertainty of life. The fact that time and chance is something that happens to all mankind. And then he focuses on the fact that wisdom is not always rewarded and listened to there at the end. That's something that you would think is certain in life, but is not. As we get into chapter 9, our key verse, or verses, both chapters have two key verses, back-to-back verses. It's actually 2 and 3 in both of the chapters tonight. But chapter 9, verses 2 and 3 is our key verse for chapter 9. All things come alike to all. One event happens to the righteous and the wicked, to the good, the clean, and the unclean, to him who sacrifices and to him who does not sacrifice. As is the good, so is the sinner. He who takes an oath is he who fears an oath. This is an evil, and all that is done under the sun, that one thing happens to all. Truly the hearts of the sons of men are full of evil. Madness is in their hearts while they live, and after that they go to the dead. So Solomon begins there again in 1 to 10 by talking about the certainty of death. We mentioned this morning, we talked about that sin is certain, but we referenced the saying that is really meant to be more a joke about the fact that we have to pay taxes, but that there are two things that are certain in life, death and taxes. And what Solomon is focusing on here in Ecclesiastes 9 is the certainty of death. And that is, unless the Lord returns first, unless he returns while we're still living, death is something that comes to every man. In verse 1 he says, "For I considered all this in my heart, so that as to declare it all, that the righteous and the wise and their works are in the hands of God. People know neither love nor hatred, but anything they see before them. All things come alike to all. One event happens to the righteous and the wicked, to the good, the clean, and the unclean, to him who sacrifices and to him who does not sacrifice. As is the good, so is the sinner. He who takes an oath is he who fears an oath. This is an evil, and all that is done under the sun, that one thing happens to all. Truly the hearts of the sons of men are full of evil. Madness is in their hearts while they live, and after that they go to the dead." As you look at what Solomon is saying here in Ecclesiastes 9, as he begins this chapter, and considering everything, that regardless of where one is in life, again, whether righteous or wicked, the good and clean and the unclean, the one that sacrifices, the one that does not, the good and the sinner, the one who takes an oath, the one who fears an oath, that at the end, this is what happens to all. That after that they go to the dead. One lives righteous, that is their end. One lives unrighteous, that is their end. That's why in 1 Kings, in something that perhaps may have crossed the mind of Solomon, even as he's writing this, is that David told Solomon near the end of his own life that he was going the way of all the earth. A similar statement to that Joshua made in his farewell address in chapters 23 and 24 of Joshua, where Joshua told the people of Israel that he was going the way of all the earth. The Hebrew writer, in pointing out about the fact that Christ was sacrificed once, just as we die once, made this statement: "It is appointed to man once to die, but after this, the judgment." Hebrews 9 and in verse 27. Death is something that happens to all, whether good or bad. It's just a fact of life. But it does not have to be a doom and gloom outlook on life, if you will. Some have had the picture, and we mentioned this at the beginning, that some have had the idea that this book as a whole is really just this sort of gloomy look on life. And that's not at all what Solomon's doing. What Solomon's doing is showing where our focus should be in serving God. But in verse 4, in dealing with a section on a very serious topic, we mentioned that this morning. That sin was serious, but we mentioned other serious things, and we said, we don't laugh at the funeral home. Maybe if somebody told a joke about the person, but it's a serious matter. Death is something that's serious. It's something that comes to everyone, but it's something that we do not have to face without hope, verse 4. Because as long as one lives, there's hope to do what needs to be done. But for him who is joined to all the living, there is hope. For a living dog is better than a dead lion. He parallels a dog, and Our society today, we think a lot more of dogs than they would have back in that day. In our society today, dogs are something that are pets. They're treated like they're part of the family. They are something that in our society is treated with respect, where back then, being a dog was something that was, the dog was looked down upon. One of those statements that changed. Now somebody calls somebody a dog, and I think it's supposed to mean it's cool. But back then, if somebody said a person was a dog, it was meant in a derogatory way because that's how they looked down on it. But you know what? That animal, as much as it's looked down on, a dog that's alive is better than a lion that's dead. And the point that Solomon is making there, that for him who is joined to all the living, there's hope. As long as we have life, there's hope. Maybe somebody looks at their condition in their life and says, you know what, I'm not living righteous. Well, the end of the one that's not living righteous is the same end as the one that is living righteous in terms of on this earth. That is the certainty of death. But there's hope to change. Why? Because you're still alive. There's hope as long as one is alive. But then Solomon points this out, and really a straightforward statement here, but he points out in 5 and 6 that what death means is it means that our life on earth is over. Right? There's no more chance for things under the sun. For the living know they will die, but the dead know nothing. And they have no more reward, for the memory of them is forgotten. Also their love, their hatred, and their envy have now perished. Nevermore will they have a share in anything done under the sun. Now, Solomon's picture here is that when life is over, it's just over. But that's not the picture that even Solomon himself would mention in this book. We're going to stand before God in judgment, chapter 12. He mentioned it, chapter 3. But Solomon's point is this. In terms of our ability to do anything on this earth, when we die, that is it. We share no more in anything done under the sun. And so as long as we live, verse 4, there's hope. But verses 5 and 6, when we're gone, that's it. Think of the story of the rich man and Lazarus, who in Luke chapter 16, that rich man died, and he was carried away to torment, and Lazarus died and was in Abraham's bosom. And at that moment, the rich man's fate, Lazarus too for the good, but focusing on the bad, at that moment, the rich man's fate was sealed. We can't change our fate after death. There's nothing that can be done. And so when we die, our fate is sealed. We have no more partaking in under the sun, not just enjoying the things of life, but no more chance to change under the sun. But verse 4, as long as we live, there is hope. Well, what does that mean we should do then? Well, verses 7 to 10 then, Solomon deals really with the response to the certainty of death. Death is something that's going to happen, but what should you do? Well, number one, Solomon will point out in verse 7, enjoy life. Go, eat your bread with joy, and drink your wine with a merry heart, for God has already accepted your words. Solomon has pointed that out time and time again. Life is short, enjoy it. Now we know from other chapters we enjoy it because it's a gift from God. We enjoy it because we can only truly enjoy it when we're serving God. But his point is, life under the sun, enjoy life. But while you enjoy life, verse 8, remember to stay pure. Let your garments always be white. Let your head lack no oil. That is, while you're enjoying life, make sure you're enjoying life while staying pure. Being the kind of people you need to be pleasing to God. Verse 9, live joyfully with the wife whom you love all the days of your vain life, which he's given you under the sun, all the days of vanity, for that is your portion in life and in the labor which you perform under the sun. Enjoy family. While here on earth, while we face the certainty of death, we should enjoy life, we should stay pure, we should enjoy family, but also, verse 10, we need to make sure in our life to work hard. Whatever your hand finds to do, do it with your might. For there is no work or device or knowledge or wisdom in the grave where you are going. I believe it was John Wooden, and I don't have the exact quote of what he said, but John Wooden, you may recall, he was the legendary basketball coach of the UCLA Bruins for many years. Coached players like Kareem Abdul-Jabbar and others. back in the day, has most of the NCAA records when he retired, longest win streaks, championships. There was a book that was written. I can't remember if he wrote the book or the book was simply written about him. That was about really 7 principles that Wooden had. And I remember in reading that, one of the things that's mentioned is he would tell people, if you don't have time to do it right the first time, what makes you think you're going to have time to do it again? And really what he was trying to teach them was, you need to learn to work hard. That's what the Bible teaches us. Whatever our hand finds to do it with your might. We can't half-heartedly work on things in life and expect it to be okay. Paul would bring up a similar point in Colossians chapter 3, and I believe it's verse 23, and whatever your hand finds to do, do it heartily as to the Lord. And so we're not working to please the boss. I think I've used this illustration before. Being a manager at the Chick-fil-A I worked at, I'd have people that they'd work hard as long as I was standing there watching them, but if I went to the office for something, I could watch them on the cameras and they dragged their feet and changed. Why? Boss wasn't around to get on to. Then you come back around and everybody starts working hard again. That's not how we're supposed to work. That's not what the Bible says. We're to work hard. In light of the certainty of death, one of the things Solomon says to do is make sure to work hard. Make sure there's no regrets as to how hard we work. But after dealing with the certainty of death, Solomon then deals with the uncertainty of life. And as we mentioned, there's 2 things he deals with there. The first of those is the fact that time and chance happen to all. I returned and saw under the sun that the race is not to the swift, nor the battle to the strong, nor bread to the wise, nor riches to men of understanding, nor favor to men of skill, but time and chance happen to all. For man also does not know his time, like fish taken in a cruel net, like birds caught in a snare, so the sons of men are snared in an evil time, when it falls suddenly upon them. The point of 11 and 12 is this, that as life goes on, the race is not swift, the battle is not strong, the bread is not wise, the riches of men, nor are riches to men of understanding, nor favor to the men of skill, but it's time and that happen to them all. Regardless of if man is wise, regardless of if man is a fool, regardless of if man is righteous, regardless of if man is unrighteous, regardless of if he's wise, regardless of if he's poor. Whatever our condition in life, time and chance happen to all. Sometimes time and chance happen for good things. Sometimes time and chance just happen for bad things. People sometimes ask the question, why me, Lord? Why am I suffering in this life? And we don't always know the answer to that. Job, by the way, did not know the answer to that. You go through Job, people sometimes say Job is about why we suffer. No, it's not. Job is about accepting that we need to serve the Lord even when we suffer. Because when you get to the end, Job's not told why he suffered. We know why Job suffered. Job doesn't know why Job suffered there. But the point was not to question God. But as Job is suffering in life, like us, we may, like Job, never know why we suffered in this life. Sometimes it's because of sin. Death is a result of the fact that man has sinned, Genesis chapter 3. Sometimes it's a result of our own unrighteousness. Maybe we did something that caused something to come upon us. Sometimes it's somebody else's unrighteousness. Maybe somebody else drinks and drives and we don't, but they hit us. Sometimes it's just simply time and chance, as Solomon points out here. That's just something that happens to everyone. For a man who does not know his time, like a fish taken in a cruel net, like birds caught in a snare, and the sons of men are snared in an evil time when it falls suddenly upon them. Just time and chance, and things just happen to everyone. It's not because somebody's righteous or unrighteous. It's just sometimes time and chance happen to all. 13 to 18 then is focused on the fact wisdom is not always rewarded and listened to. This wisdom I have also seen under the sun, and it seemed great to me. There was a little city with few men in it, and a great king came against it, besieged it, and built great snares around it. Now there was found in it a poor wise man, and he by his wisdom delivered the city. Yet no one remembered the same poor man. Then I said, wisdom is better than strength. Nevertheless, the poor man's wisdom is despised, and his words are not heard. Words of the wise spoken quietly should be heard, rather than the shout of the ruler of fools. Wisdom is better than the weapons of war, but one sinner destroys much good. As you look at what he's saying there in life, you would think one thing that should be certain in life is that people are going to listen to wisdom. And that's not the case. Here's a ruler that comes against these people. It's a small city. He comes in, he takes it. This ruler does. Yet there's this one poor wise man who by his wisdom is able to deliver the city, and then nobody remembers it. Nobody thinks about the wisdom. Nobody remembers it. His words are not heard. And Solomon's point is this: the words of the wise that are spoken quietly should be heard rather than the shout of the ruler of fools. Sometimes, and I think even with majority, we hear people say that the majority of people believe in something. I think sometimes it's the majority of people that believe something in our society today. Sometimes it's just those people speak the loudest. And I think sometimes people think that as long as somebody speaks loudly, they've got something wise to say, and that's simply not the case. Some of the most foolish things that are pushed in our society are probably the people that speak the loudest. But wisdom, even when it's quiet, is something that man should listen to. That's the point that Solomon's making. It's not certain that wisdom is going to be rewarded and listened to, but it should be rewarded and listened to. Go to chapter 10 now. Ecclesiastes chapter 10, the danger of folly contrasted with the value of wisdom. Again, we just dealt last week in chapter 7 with the value of wisdom. As we've been mentioning, there's no new material. We're coming back to talk more about how valuable wisdom is in chapter 10. Verses 2 and 3, as we mentioned already, again, just as with the previous chapter, are the verses of this chapter. A wise man's heart is at his right hand, but a fool's heart is at his left. Even when a fool walks along the way, he lacks wisdom, and he shows everyone that he is full. So verses 1 to 3 begins with the danger of folly. There's 3 sections to this chapter: the danger of folly, the value of wisdom, and then how to deal with the ruler at the end of the chapter. When it comes to the danger of folly, verse 1 would first point out that folly ruins a reputation. Dead flies putrefy the perfumer's ointment and cause it to give off a foul odor. So does a little folly to the one respected for wisdom and honor. A reputation is something that takes a long time to build up. It takes but one very foolish decision to undo all that building up of a reputation that one does. And what Solomon is pointing out is just like you have this perfumer's ointment. It's supposed to be this very nice ointment. Get a dead fly in it, and all of a sudden it doesn't smell like this very nice ointment anymore. When the dead fly's there, it putrefies the ointment, as he says in verse 1. That's what folly does to a reputation, to the one respected for wisdom and honor. I want you to think for just a minute, and you've probably heard a statement like this before. When we think of Solomon, 2 things come to mind, and they're very contradictory if you think about it. And what I mean by that is this: when we think about Solomon, we think about a man with great wisdom. We also think about a man that made some really dumb mistakes. Now, for a man with all that wisdom, oftentimes he's remembered a lot more for the mistakes than the wisdom. And that is despite everything that Solomon did. And again, I think Ecclesiastes is at the end of his life. I think this book is an indication that he repented. But for all of that Solomon did, we often remember him, and even Nehemiah later on holds Solomon up as an example of what happens when one is not wise and who they marry. He was a very wise man who made some foolish decisions, and we remember him often for those decisions. Think about how differently Solomon might be remembered if not for all the women that he married that turned his heart from God. And then you take again what he's saying in verse 1. Perhaps that may even be in Solomon's mind, that people from far and wide, how wise Solomon is, and then he turns his heart from God, and the people around are thinking, what is wrong with him? How could somebody so wise be so stupid at the same time? And Solomon, perhaps looking back on his life, realized he had ruined his reputation with a little folly. And so the danger of folly is folly ruins a reputation. Say another thing. It's not a good guide. A wise man's heart's at his right hand, but a fool's heart is at his left. It's not the guide you need to be following. Folly's not the kind of thing you want guiding your life. And then verse 3, Folly shows that a fool is a fool. Even when a fool walks along the way, he lacks wisdom, and he shows everyone that he is a fool. You want to know who's a fool? Basically, is what Solomon's saying. Watch where he's going, and his foolishness is going to show that he is a fool. That's the danger of folly. It's then contrast in 4 through 15 with the value of wisdom. Beginning at verse 4, if the spirit of the ruler rises against you, do not leave your post, for conciliation pacifies great offenses. There is an evil I have seen under the sun, and an error proceeding from the ruler. Folly is set in great dignity, while the rich sit in a lowly place. I have seen servants on horses, while princes walk on the ground like servants. And what Solomon says first and foremost is, when you have wisdom, it provides value in how you deal with ungodly rulers. Here's an ungodly ruler that's not what they need to be, and maybe people's mindset is, let's overthrow the ruler. I saw something about that we talked about in previous study last week. Maybe some of them think, well, I'd make a better ruler than that, and so they come up with some idea. What Solomon says is, do not leave post. Don't try to rebel against the ungodly ruler. Don't try to leave where you are. You stay where you should be. See what he then says in 5 to 7, when that wisdom's going to help you, because you're going to realize at times when you have rulers that are incompetent that things are backward. Look at 5 to 7. There's error proceeding from a ruler. Folly is set in great dignity. Now wait a minute. Didn't Solomon just say how bad folly was? Yeah. Yet under this unwise ruler, from which error is proceeding, folly is set in a place of exalted position. The rich are sat in a lowly place. Servants are on horses, while the princes are the ones walking the ground like servants. The point that Solomon's making is sometimes you have to realize that when people are in positions of authority that are just not good rulers, they're some foolish rulers. You have to understand that sometimes things seem backwards. But the key, I think, to this section is verse 4. Do not leave your post. Even though it seems unfair, even though it doesn't seem right, what's going on, do not leave your post. That's what wisdom tells you, even when dealing with ungodly rulers. Look at the next thing he says in 8 and 9. Wisdom provides value because it teaches you to avoid danger. He who digs a pit will fall into it. Whoever breaks through a wall will be bitten by a serpent. He who quarries stone may be hurt by them, and he who splits wood may be endangered by it. I think verse 10, which is about how wisdom makes work easier, shows us how we avoid danger. The axe is dull, and one does not sharpen the edge, but he must use more strength. But wisdom brings success. This wisdom tells you to avoid danger. You're not the person that digs the pit and falls in. You're not the person that breaks through a wall where there's a venomous serpent on the other side ready to strike. You're not the one that quarries the stone to be hit. You're not the one who splits the wood, but is endangered by the job that you're doing. And I think the avoiding danger again comes to verse 10, because you have the wisdom to do things in a wise way. Take an axe that's very dull and try to split wood. You might hurt yourself in the process. I remember several years ago, I had a group of homeschoolers that we were, when I was in Alabama, that we were in, and we did some, it was called Contenders for the Faith. It's kind of like Boy Scouts, but they were, the idea of it was you earned these badges and things, and one of them, the classes we had in the group, was about knife safety. I remember at the time learning that a sharp knife is better than a dull knife, and that just didn't make any sense to me at the time. Well, how could you be less likely to hurt yourself with a sharp knife than the dull knife? Shouldn't the dull knife be safer? Well, one of the things we had to do was whittle on sticks. And if you've ever tried to do that with a dull knife and then with a sharp knife, you'll realize a sharp knife does a much more efficient and better job. Well, the fool's the one that doesn't sharpen the axe and tries to cut the wood, and he does so to his own detriment, versus the one who has wisdom that brings success. Beginning at verse 11 now, the value of wisdom is that wisdom allows you to, or tells you to watch your words. A serpent may bite when it is not charmed. The babbler is no different. The words of a wise man's mouth are gracious, but the lips of a fool shall swallow him up. The words of his mouth begin with foolishness, and the end of his talk is raving madness. A fool also multiplies words. No man knows what is to be. Who can tell him what will be after him? The labor of fools wearies them, for they do not even know how to go the city. He talks about watching his words. He points out three things. Number one, the wise man who watches his words is not like the babbler. The babbler is like the uncharmed serpent. You've seen those videos where a serpent's in front of somebody and they try to charm the serpent in some music that they supposedly play that keeps it from biting them? Why would you try that? Well, because if you don't, it's going to bite you. And the babbler, his words are like the uncharmed serpent. They'll come back to bite him. They're not filled with wisdom. But the wise man, his words are gracious, verse 12, while the fool's words are things that bring destruction. The lips of the fool swallow him up. His mouth begins with foolishness, and the end of his talk is raving madness. Wisdom teaches us to watch our words. One more thing here in chapter 10, and then we'll make some practical application of these two chapters. Verses 16 to 18 now, wisdom in dealing with a ruler. Verse 16 beginning, Woe to you, O land, when your king is a child, and your princes feast in the morning. Blessed are you, O land, when your king is the son of nobles, and your princes feast at the proper time, for strength and not for drunkenness. Because of laziness the building decays, and through idleness of hands the house leaks. A feast is made for laughter, and wine makes merry, but money answers everything. Do not curse the king even in your thought. Do not curse the rich even in your bedroom, for a bird of the air may carry your voice, and a bird in flight may tell the matter. You go back to what he's saying here about rulers. He starts with foolish rulers, and there's three things they do. Number one, verse 16 and 17, they feasted in proper times. Remember we talked earlier in the book that there's a time for everything. The foolish ruler, he just makes time for feasting whenever he wants to be feasting. Sometimes as a ruler, there's important decisions that have to be made, but the foolish ruler just sort of does what he wants to do. Verse 18, he's lazy. That's why the building decays. It's by the idleness of his hands that the house leaks. And then verse 19, he thinks money answers everything. A feast is made for laughter and wine makes merry, but money answers everything. That's the foolish ruler's point of view. Now, you ever think about the idea that really his idea is if there's a problem, money will fix it. Give me a blank check, I'll write whatever out I need to fix, and that money's going to fix the problem. Solomon's point is that's not a wise ruler, that's what a foolish ruler thinks. Well, then in verse 20, despite the fact that you're dealing with foolish rulers, do not curse them. Verse 20, do not curse the king, do not curse the rich, do not curse those even though they may be foolish. Particularly focusing on the king in verse 20, even when you're under a foolish ruler, treat them with the dignity and respect that the position would demand. Much like Paul would point out in Romans chapter 13, Peter would point out in 1 Peter chapter 2. So that's Ecclesiastes 9 and 10. Chapter 9, death is certain, life is not. And then chapter 10, the contrast of folly versus the value of wisdom. Let's talk about some practical lessons. 4 lessons I want to focus on this evening, a way of practical application to our life, and then we'll close this evening. The first lesson we need to understand is that, again, as we mentioned earlier, life is short and death is certain. Life's short in that we don't know. However long we live, it's ultimately short, but that life is something that's fleeting. And I want you to go back to verse 9 or chapter 9 with me. And I want you to look at verse 9 again. Remember, we've got our key words of the book. We haven't been going through. I hope you've been going through. I've got them highlighted in my Bible, going through and noting all of these. Vain, under the sun, grasping for the wind. But the word Hebel, that is translated vanity throughout the book. Remember, chapter 1, verse 2, vanity of vanity says the preacher, vanity of vanities, all is vanity. That word that occurs 30-something times in Ecclesiastes. It is 38 times in Ecclesiastes. It occurs here in verse 9 when he says, live joyfully with the wife whom you love all the days of your vain life. Remember again that word vain. It's something that is fleeting. It is a mist or a vapor. Very similar to what James says in James chapter 4. What is our life but a vapor that appears for a short time and vanishes away? Life is short. It's a mist. It's a vapor. Regardless of how long one lives, life is still a vapor that's here and in an instant can be gone. The reason that life is short is because of that certainty of death. And so we've got to realize that we need to live in light of the fact that someday our life on earth will end. Either we will die, or if Christ returns first, we'll be called to meet Him in the air. But either way, our life is eventually going to end. Say a second thing. Time and chance happen to all. Time and chance happen to all. And sometimes, as we talked about earlier, people want to know, why does bad things happen to this person? Why is it happening to me? And sometimes the answer is because time and chance just happen to everyone. There's things that just happen. Sometimes people have good luck and sometimes people have bad luck. And that's just part of life. Not because somebody's righteous and unrighteous. That's not always why suffering happens. Sometimes it's just time, chance. Third thing I learned is that folly can ruin a reputation. That should be verse 1 of chapter 10, where the fly putrefies the perfumer's ointment. All the wise decisions one can make, and it can take one foolish one, and a whole lot of built-up reputation can come crumbling. And finally, I learned of the value of wisdom in 4 to 15. That should. Whether it's about dealing with rulers or watching our tongue or how hard we work or avoiding danger, whatever it is, I learned that there is great value in wisdom from chapter 9 and chapter 10. That is a quick summary of Ecclesiastes 9 and 10. We've gone through it a little quickly this evening here in 9 and 10, but those are some very important practical lessons for us to learn here in Ecclesiastes. Again, Lord willing, next Sunday evening, we will bring to a close this series of studies. We're going to study chapter 11 and chapter 12. Perhaps at least 12, but perhaps the two chapters, but at least the chapter we are most familiar with in the book as we close our study next week in Ecclesiastes. But it may be now, as we come to a close here this evening, that there may be one or more present who may have never responded in obedience to the gospel. And as we said earlier in the lesson, that life is short and death is certain. And the fact is, while death is certain, it is uncertain of when it will come. At least we don't know when. James pointed out in James chapter 1, it's that vapor that's here and gone. We do not know what tomorrow may bring. We may have but a few hours left, a few minutes, a few hours, even a few seconds left on this earth. We may have a few decades left. We just simply do not know. I'll tell you what I do know. You have opportunity this evening to make any necessary corrections you need to make. If you're here and you've not yet obeyed the gospel, but you've heard the word of God, and you believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of the living God, any of your sins, confess your faith in Him, being buried in the waters of baptism, rising to walk in the newness of life, having your sins forgiven, having that hope of heaven while life on earth is over. And even if you were to face the uncertainty of life and facing the certainty of death this evening, you would have that hope of heaven. Maybe you're here and you've done that, but somewhere along the line you say, I've wandered away from God. You have opportunity to make correction this evening. Sin of a private nature, take it to the Lord privately in prayer. But if it's a sin of a public nature, you desire the prayers of the congregation, we'll gladly pray with you and for you for God to forgive you. No matter what your need is, if we could assist you in any way, would you not come forward right now? Together we stand as we say.